You're listening to Why We Do What We Do. Welcome to Why We Do What We Do. I am your food-loving host, Abraham.
And I'm your tasty host, Shane.
We're a psychology podcast. We talk about all of the things that people do. And for the longest run in the history of this podcast, we have stuck to the same general topic now for many weeks. We've been talking about addiction.
Look at us go.
Yeah.
It's been super enlightening. And hopefully, as y'all are listening to this, you have gained some new perspective, maybe some new thoughts, some new ideas, or maybe just a general interest in studying this stuff a little bit more, because it is pretty complex, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I like that. I feel like I've learned a lot. I feel like it's been interesting. I've been really proud of the work we've done on these topics, because I think we got to bring the sort of level of both science skepticism and humanism that is endemic to what we try to do as a podcast to a topic that I think is complicated and difficult and affects an enormous amount of people that are out there. So hopefully you've been with us on this journey. And if not, you're joining us for the first time, welcome. And I always like to say at the beginning of these particular episodes that although these are themed around the same topic of addiction, we do specifically plan to have them be able to stand on their own. So if you've missed them up to this point, you're not gonna not understand what we're talking about. We'll probably reference those previous episodes. It turns out we've been doing that a lot.
Yeah.
And I do recommend that you go check them out. But as I was saying, I don't think that you need them in order to understand what we're talking about today. This is not like a multi-part series. It's just that we felt we have so much to explore in this topic that we wanted to just dedicate space to it for a while.
Yeah, exactly. Each topic that we've covered, and this is not going to be an exhaustive list of stuff too. This series is not going to be exhaustive, but each topic that we've covered has deserved its kind of own spotlight around just the topic itself and unpacking it and giving it kind of the discussion that it needed.
Yeah, precisely. So anyway, if you are joining us on the day that this publishes, then I'd like to wish you happy Bitcoin Pizza Day, which is definitely a day that needs some explanation, but we're not going to do that now. We're just going to move on.
Yeah, good luck with that. It's Canadian Immigrants Day as well.
And Emergency Medical Services for Children Day. That seems very important.
Yes, it's Harvey Milk Day in California.
Interesting. Not the kind of milk that you drink.
Nope.
It is International Day for Biological Diversity. That one is fantastic. Definitely a huge fan of that.
Yeah, I love that one for sure. It's National Maritime Day as well. So for those of you who are, boaters.
Yeah. It is National Solitaire Day for those of you who are boaters, or for those of you who like card games.
I love that too. It's National Vanilla Pudding Day, which, I think that vanilla doesn't get the credit it deserves. It's a pretty decent flavor.
It is. It's really good. I think. And it's in so many things. Like it just makes things better. Yeah. It's like it's almost like salt, and that like you don't like salt just helps make everything better. But vanilla you actually could eat on its own and it's good. You probably wouldn't want to just eat salt on its own.
Right. Exactly.
It is Sherlock Holmes Day for you Sir Arthur Conan Doyle fans.
Mm-hmm. And certainly not a Moriarty Day. We don't like that guy as far as that day goes.
That's right.
It's World Goth Day, so get your Hot Topic gift cards out.
It is Healthcare Documentation Integrity Week. That's a critically important topic, and I'm thinking maybe we just do that all the time instead of just this week.
Yes. Yeah, we should do it all the time. It's National Safe Boating Week, so for those of you who are on Maritime Day, then just make sure you're also being safe while you're in a boat.
Yeah, all week long. It is National Unicycle Week, so one cycle for you.
Single cycle. And it's also National Backyard Games Week, so hopefully there's a lot of cornhole tournaments going on this week.
You could play board games in your backyard, and then they could still be a backyard game.
That's true. We should do that more often. Because you can't play Monopoly in a windy place unless you're using credit cards.
Well, you shouldn't play it anyway. So anyway, we are going to get to our topic at hand today, which has nothing to do with any of those holidays. We do like to share them because we think it's fun and an acknowledgement of the day on which this publishes. And again, if you're joining us for the first time, welcome. We are so happy to have you here. If you would like to support us at the end of this discussion, I will talk more about ways that you can do that. But really quickly, you can leave us a rating and review, join us on Patreon, subscribe, like, share us with a friend, pick up some merch. You can start a center to treat different addictions and call it Why We Do What We Do, Why We Don't Do What We Do, something like that.
Why we don't do what we did anymore.
There you go. And then just put our like sticker on your logo or something. Anyway,
Yeah.
I'll talk more about those at the end of this discussion. Today, we've been talking about behavioral addictions, and we're continuing that part. So we had originally started this discussion or these series of episodes largely focused on chemical type addictions like drugs and alcohol, that sort of thing. And that's not to say that we weren't talking about topics that were relevant to non-chemical addictions, but we have since sort of moved to talking more about some of the what you might call behavioral addictions. Also, you might refer to these, and we'll talk about that today, I'm sure, is behavioral excess, basically the repertoires that happen at a frequency that is so high that it starts to become problematic. And we've talked about gambling, we've talked about sex, and today we're talking about food.
I think this episode deserves a fair kind of disclaimer that I think people generally have a pretty complicated relationship with food.
Yeah.
And
that's
there
fair.
are lots of ways that manifests. And so just to kind of prepare everybody, we are going to be talking about food and relationships with food and what that looks like. So just if this is not something that's a comfortable topic for you, by all means, turn it off or, skip around if you want to. But we try to keep it light and we try to kind of get into definitions and some science behind this. And specifically what we're going to talk about is food addiction. But eating disordered and disordered eating in general is going to come up quite a few times as we talk about this.
Yeah, good point. All right, so let's unpack the background here on this.
Yeah, so food addiction or eating addiction, sometimes you'll see those terms that are used interchangeably. This is classified as a behavioral addiction categorized by compulsive eating, usually related to high fat, high sugar, or high salt foods. So you'll see kind of those three things come up quite often. But you'll see in relation to the term food addiction, that will come up.
So not a lot of people who are addicted to like eating kale or uncooked onions or something.
We are going to talk about that, actually.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Now, I think it is important to clarify the difference between food addiction and those other food-related disorders or eating-related disorders that someone might experience. I think you might be hearing this and think about things like binge eating, for example. This does refer to episodes of this sort of uncontrollable eating, just consuming nonstop. Mm-hmm. That is, I think, definitely a discussion that deserves episode length or multi-episode length treatment and discussion. But we are not talking about binge eating as it relates to food addiction or eating addiction.
And then also, you'll see the term disordered eating. So the reason I put these two in here in the notes is because a lot of times when you're looking up food addiction, these two come up as like kind of primary examples. Is people eating too much or they have a disordered eating. And when I say disordered eating, what I'm referring to is a variety of disorders that relate to eating behavior or food-related behavior. And this can include compulsive eating, self-induced vomiting, chronic restrained eating, the use of diet pills, emotional eating, night eating, and secret food concocting, which specifically refers to when people combine what they describe as embarrassing food combinations.
Like pineapple on pizza.
Like pineapple. There you go. Or like somebody mentioned like chocolate covered pickles. Somebody mentioned
wow.
Peanut butter and onion sandwiches, like stuff like that people are like kind of like weird about. They feel weird about, they feel guilt about. That's one of the things they talked about.
People who like the toothpaste and orange juice combination type thing.
Which, yeah, there's probably exactly one person out there because that is the worst. I, when I was growing up, used to like to put cheese Doritos on my peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but I feel like that was nice.
Sure, I could see it.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to when we did our first discussion on sex addiction and we were starting to unpack behavioral disorders more generally. We sort of lumped them or further broke them down, if you will, into categories of sort of biologically necessary behaviors like eating, like sex, that can be done to excess. And then there's the sort of biologically unnecessary disorders like gambling,
right?
Or other. I think there's plenty that we could even think of that sort of look like addiction. There's like exercise addiction, like those type of things, right?
Right.
Where you have something that you don't actually need to do to stay alive, but you obviously could do. And that's sort of where I think there's some utility there because there's something just, I think, inherently important about understanding our relationship to biologically necessary processes as it relates to something like addiction, because we do it all the time because we kind of have to,
right?
Or like we're biologically prepared to do so in such a way that it's almost like we absolutely have to. And so in keeping in line with what we know about addiction, food addiction, again, implies that there is a dependency. And we do depend on food. And it's not problematic because it is necessary for our survival.
Right.
But in this case, it's usually like a dependency on specific foods. And as you had mentioned, sort of those very highly palatable foods, high in fat, high in sugar, very, very tasty, if you will, like a cake addiction.
Yes, or chips or popcorn or something that's like not, something that's like very specific and that we tend to overeat or engage in that behavioral excess that you mentioned.
Yeah, like peanut butter for me.
Me too. Love peanut butter, love chocolate. I could eat so much chocolate sitting in one setting. It could be a problem, but I tend to keep that in mind. I have a very kind of like, I have too much of a sweet tooth. Well, and that's a different conversation for a different day. So what happens here in this space is that, and this is kind of what some of the studies have shown or people describe as happening inside of this, is that reward systems in the brain are activated when accessing specific foods. So what they say is that ongoing contact with these specific foods can lead to pattern behavior and described as either a psychological or an emotional dependence on accessing said food. And we're going to kind of talk about different ways that manifests, but essentially it's not necessarily a chemical dependency, although some studies show that people are highly sensitive to certain foods. What they find more often is that when they're discussing what they call food addiction, is it's mostly psychologically related or it's emotionally related.
Yeah, I was going to say, based on this, we're talking about it invoking the reward system of the brain. I think there's the quick side conversation to have about like, as we evolved, it was advantageous for us evolutionarily to enjoy foods that were very calorically dense because our food supply was not consistent often and not necessarily predictable. And so foods that would sustain us longer and would give us more bang for our buck, basically per bite, were good. And now that we've engineered our way to unrestricted access to these types of foods, what we've run into is we then have to manage the biological necessity to want to consume calorically dense foods.
Right.
And a lot of people talk about this. And so a very short way of saying that it activates the reward system in your brain is we like stuff that tastes good.
Yeah.
And it tastes good because it was good for us to like that type of thing when we needed more calories. Good stuff is good is the way to frame that.
Right. I mean, that's really, it makes sense, right? Like there's very rarely we eat food that we're like, oh, this is disgusting, I'm going to keep eating it.
Right.
Unless it's like, I don't know, some vegetable you don't like or whatever. But for the most part, we tend to go after foods that we find pleasant to eat. Now, there's a difference between eating food that is pleasant to eat, maybe eating too much of that food, and then going to the level of, I desperately need that food for comfort or peace or stress relief or whatever it might be. Like there is kind of that line that we get to that's it's we have to kind of pay attention to that piece.
Yes. And so we'll talk about, I think, some of the symptoms of food addiction after we listen to some ads. Okay, so we are back. Let's talk about what we're sort of looking for if we're trying to identify food addiction.
Yeah, so there are some symptoms that you might look for. One of them is compulsive overeating, and one of them is eating alone. Now, this does not mean going to a restaurant and having a meal by yourself. There's nothing wrong with that, doing that every now and again. What this is talking about more so is like most of your meals are eaten alone, in secret, in private, that kind of thing.
Guess I have some confessing to do. There's also gaining weight rapidly and then eating to the point of stomach discomfort, which for those of you who are unaware, I don't know how often this is the case. It seems like in my travels, it's fairly rare. But in Nevada specifically, we have what is called all-you-can-eat sushi, which is you pay a flat rate and then you get as much sushi as you like for the entire evening. They're very strict about like you can't throw out the rice, you have to eat everything, you can't waste any food. But if you follow those rules, they will just keep giving you sushi endlessly. And that incentivizes eating to the point of stomach discomfort. And most people do.
Yes. See, in Florida, we have what's called a golden corral, and people do that a lot there too. You know, somebody brought up the idea of eating sushi in the desert and how strange that seems. And so
Fair.
I guess maybe, you know, everybody's got their thing. I don't know. I mean, the sushi I eat, I would feel pretty safe eating in the desert. But I guess maybe if there was fish on it, that would be a different problem.
I mean, I'm only like a 2.5 hour drive to the ocean. So it's not like it's that far away.
No, that's not bad.
From where we're at. Yeah. I mean, further inland, obviously, it starts to get harder. But we're also close to Lake Tahoe, which has a lot of fish. But also, when you're eating a plant-based sort of lifestyle, there are no fish in the sushi to worry about. It's more about the seaweed, nori, and other vegetables they put in it, and like the sauces that they use. Yeah. So there's that.
I get that. So some of the other things too would be consuming food rapidly, decreased mobility from withdrawal or withdrawal from activities due to weight gain, and feelings of guilt.
There's also a feeling or sense of loss of control, depression, mood swings are going to be expected, and then hiding consumption. So you might eat late at night, eat in the car, hide foods to eat later. Those are all sort of things that you might be on the lookout for.
Something I want to point out, though, is that any of these things that are described here might not necessarily be food addiction related. So as an example, as somebody who grew up in a house where there's maybe like food scarcity, consuming food quickly meant that you got seconds. Right? Like you ate your food quickly because there were multiple people, and like the first person to finish their plate was the first person to get seconds, which meant you got more food. It wasn't because you were addicted to food, is because there was a practical, pragmatic reason for it, right?
100%.
Or gaining rapidly could be a hormonal change, you know, or feelings of guilt could just be you're Catholic. So like, I think it's really important to kind of remember that as we talk about this, there might be some other reasons that these symptoms are coming up that are not inherently related to having a food addiction.
And that actually comes back to what we talked about when we were discussing sex addiction, is oftentimes what you're actually looking at is some other issue that's going on. And as part of the spectrum of like related things that go along with that particular condition or issue, you might see an excess of this particular thing. And so I think that's very similar here to where like when you have what's seen sometimes as other mental health issues, you might have a corresponding change in other behaviors like sleep, like sex, like eating, that then look like those are the problem when they're actually more of a symptom of the problem, if that makes sense.
Right. The stuff that we just talked about, these patterned kind of behaviors that are occurring, if it's not treated effectively or addressed in some way, it can actually lead to more complex eating disorders, can lead to obesity and other adverse health conditions that might arise from eating certain types of foods, right? Like diabetes or heart conditions or fatty liver. There's a lot of things that could happen that are like actual medical conditions that can occur as a result of excessive eating of certain foods.
It sounds like we should talk about how to treat this then.
Of course, we should talk about how to treat this. So we are going to do a full episode on treatments for addiction in general, like probably the next episode.
Yeah.
But since this type of addiction, and I'm going to start here by saying this quote unquote addiction, and you'll see kind of where that goes. But this type of quote unquote addiction appears to have a distinct characteristic compared to others. And we thought it would be good to kind of cover some of the things that are done to treat psychological food dependence, like why people are going to this type of food, why they continue to access this food, besides the fact that it just tastes well. So why or how are we treating this? What are some ways that we're doing it? One of them is medication.
Yeah, drugs are the solution to all things.
Isn't that funny? Drugs to treat addiction?
That's right. Drugs to treat drugs. So we have drugs like, lisdexamfetamine and fluoxetine are both approved. So these are a couple of drugs that are both approved to treat these types of concerns with unregulated food eating, if you will. There are also some off-label uses, which means not prescribed for this specifically. SSRIs, the typical antidepressors like trazodone, and there are anti-obesity medications and appetite suppressants that have also been used as a means to help reduce the compulsive eating.
Yeah, so something that you'll learn if you study like any sort of behavioral psychopharmacology, like something that, for those of you who are listening, if you've never studied any of that, psychopharmacology is super interesting, but you learn that anything with the suffix of amphetamine is likely to have an appetite suppressant type of maybe a side effect. And a lot of times that's what they use. Like, so anything with amphetamine is going to have that kind of piece to it.
Good to know.
Yeah. Now, there's also counseling. Both psychotherapy and nutritional counseling have been shown to be effective in identifying possible causes for disordered eating, as well as providing healthy alternatives, and not necessarily food alternatives when I say healthy alternatives, but more so healthy coping skills for addressing those related concerns, more so different healthy eating habits, skills around cooking and nutritional choice making and stuff like that. There are some things that exist inside of that just come from counseling and education.
And so that often means that you're probably going to see things show up in this space, as you might expect, like cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT, acceptance and commitment therapy or ACT, for functional analytic psychotherapy or FAP, and then dialectical behavioral therapy, DBT. Yeah. So there's a lot, and they all have some things in common, but they're essentially often, if not usually, one-on-one talk-based sort of therapies,
right,
where you're meeting with a counselor to help give you some strategies and guidance around your language with respect to this type of thing.
Exactly.
The next one that we've talked about medication and counseling. There is actually another, what I would consider a bit more extreme, but probably effective.
Invasive.
Yeah, and definitely more invasive intervention, which is jaw wiring. Now, I actually had to have this done to me when I was a kid. I fell out of a tree and I landed on my face and it broke my jawbone. And so to ensure that my jaw grew correctly and didn't like skew to one side, and also like when they put you in a cast, it's so that you don't move the bones that are broken to further and potentially further injure them. That's kind of the same thing with wiring your jaw if you break your jaw. So they basically insert wires up through your gums and then down to the bottom of your mouth. Ugh. So you can only open your mouth is basically stuck at like a 1/4 inch open, or almost like a centimeter open for those of us using the metric system. And it just stays that way all the time.
Yeah.
And that happened to me when I was 7, and it was not fun, and I definitely lost a lot of weight, but that might be an intentional procedure to address overeating.
Yeah, so jaw wiring is that the way they describe it is they attach orthodontic brackets or kind of similar to braces, and they wrap wire around the brackets, or they use bars and loops, or they use metal splints. There are a lot of kind of other applications for this, like you just mentioned, breaking your jaw. But the reason the jaw wiring works is not because it addresses the concern for why you are eating that food. It makes it literally impossible to eat solid foods. So patients that have their jaw wired shut just end up on a liquid diet.
Yes, which is what happens to me. I had a lot of applesauce and milkshakes, and it was terrible.
It sounds like a party, but at the same time, I would probably get real sick of milkshakes real quick, you know?
Applesauce milkshake party, yeah.
Besides jaw wiring, there is another type of intervention that they talked about when I was looking at this, and it was a 12-step program. So going back to the very first episode on this show, Alcoholics Anonymous showing up again in an episode. It is absurd how much Alcoholics Anonymous and AA has showed up in almost every episode that we've talked about this stuff.
Yeah.
Isn't that wild?
Yeah. And it was the second episode we did in the series. Our first one was actually like a definition, but it was the first full dedicated topic to a specific thing inside of addiction. But yeah, it is wildly pervasive in the realm of addiction. It seems like I think that probably anything that finds itself with the label of addiction attached to it will find in that Addiction Anonymous thing attached to it, which you probably uses the 12-step program.
Yeah, and so for food addiction or overeating, they have Overeaters Anonymous. So there is that group that exists specifically for this type of concern.
Yeah, talk about a party right there. So we've been talking about, I think, all of these are based on, us digging around and finding some of the things that exist on the internet. And Shane, thank you so much for your time and dedication in putting this all together. But there's also like actual research that we should look at. So let's review some studies here.
Yeah, so Gold and Schreiner, which, by the way, is a great team of researchers. Gold and Schreiner together, that's such a great team name.
That is pretty solid right there.
I like that. So do you ever do that? Do you ever read some research and you're like, man, those names go together real well?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I love it so much. So Golden Shriner in 2013 found that there are genetic factors that are related to possible food addiction. And what they found was that those genetic factors are heritable. So they basically said there's a primary factor in food dependency that is related to dopamine and dopaminergic. I love when we get into these episodes that have like medicine and like biology and neurology, because it makes you question whether you can read or not. Like
or speak
at all. So dopaminergic receptor supersensitivity. That I think they said that in Mary Poppins, didn't they?
Yes, that was how the song went.
I'm not even going to try to sing that. So basically what they said was people who suffer from this type of disordered eating are highly susceptible to dopamine increases, and their receptors are more likely to absorb dopamine like faster and more rapidly, and like the reward, it basically goes back to reward systems, right? And so these folks that have this type of susceptibility have an added vulnerability to addiction in other areas, not just food related. So they kind of posit the idea that if you have this super sensitivity related to your dopamine receptors, that you are not only susceptible to food addiction, but other types of addiction.
We also have Adams and colleagues 2019, and they liken food addiction to substance use disorders. Using the addiction model, which we have talked about in these episodes, they describe some common interventions that might be used, but note that due to the criteria in the DSM, the Diagnostical Statistical Manual, the substance use diagnostic criterion would really apply to very few cases related to this idea of psychological food dependency. So there's more research needed to help unpack this a bit more to make sense by trying to use that addiction framework.
There's one thing I want to say about this is that whenever you read a study, every study ends with more research is needed, right? Like we can all agree as scientists that is true. But when they go so far as to put that inside of the abstract, that tells you that there's a pretty large gap in that literature, right? Like I think if part of the results and part of the discussion overall in the abstract is we need more research on this, then that's a pretty significant gap.
Absolutely.
And then Lawson and Friends, and I like saying et al. As friends now, by the way.
Nice. I like it.
It sounds really wholesome. So Lawson and Friends in 2021 theorizes that food addiction and culture may be more linked than we studied thus far. So we haven't actually studied culture and food addiction too much. But what they did find was that the largest issues related to studying food addiction are related to lexicon. Some cultures don't even have the language to describe the phenomenon in some sort of meaningful way. And then also socio-demographic groups. Some groups just have access to more resources, so food addiction might be more prevalent in areas where there's not food scarcity. People can access that food. And additionally, they said, quote, global variations in eating culture and presentation of similar constructs, end quote, raise unique questions inside of said research. So studying food addiction across cultures, and they did specifically say food addiction is not a uniquely American thing, which is kind of nice. That it wasn't just like a USA #1 type of thing. But they did say that it was actually really difficult to research because of the descriptions and the understanding in the food culture across the world. So
right, yeah, exactly. Is that you start to move into spaces where just the culture is different around food.
Yeah.
And it definitely speaks to if you move from one culture to another and you don't even have the similar symptoms of food addiction, it starts to raise the inquiry of like, so how much of this has to be due to culture then, you know?
Right.
Because it's not even like, if you don't have the language for it, that doesn't mean that there's not some version of it that's out there. But if you don't even have the symptoms of it, then that I think speaks to something more contextually bound to the nature of the culture in that area, that is important for really understanding how something like this could even begin to take shape.
Right.
I think that's a very important consideration.
Yeah, and we do know that disordered eating is not culture bound, right? Like I think that's a really important thing to pinpoint.
Yes.
Like, you know, and so so that is like kind of one of the findings, but yeah, like it's just one of those things where it's like, hey, there's a big glaring gap in this area. We do know that disordered eating and overeating is not a culture bound phenomenon, like because we did the episode on culture-bound disorders, and it was the one where it was a Kiri, I think it was, where some men in Japan had the fear that their penis was shrinking into their bodies.
Oh, yes, that's right.
Yeah, or like ghost sickness, right?
Yeah.
So, like, we know this is a phenomenon that happens across cultures, at least. So, at least disordered eating, I should say. So, I don't know, it's super interesting to kind of look at that, and I think food culture in general, like cultures around food in general, is just really fascinating. So I'm glad that they're actually talking about what this might look like in those situations too.
You know, this joke is a little late, but you had said, like, we talked about Golden Shriner being two names that go really well together, and I was thinking Abraham and Shane are two research names that sound like they go really well together.
Yeah. Well, we used to call ourselves Shanebraham.
That is true, Shanebraham. And ads and podcasts are things that should not go together. I think I'm going to go ahead and say this now because we're reaching the end. This is going to be a sort of shorter episode. I don't think I can jinx or curse it now because we're sort of reaching the end. We do have some more interesting tidbits and some important take-home points, but hopefully we'll come in at under an hour this time.
Yeah, I think we will, but I think that, you know, that's our superpower, so we'll see.
Yes.
There are some ways that specific areas, specific parts of the world have tried to address this type of problem. In Ireland, they implemented something called a sugar tax, and they actually implemented a sugar tax not just for disordered eating, but it was really to help with concerns with obesity. What does this do? It does exactly what you think it does. It places a higher tax on what they described as harmful foods and drinks that were considered high levels of addictive types of foods, right? So like sugar, candy, sodas, like those all have a sugar tax in Ireland.
Huh. How interesting.
Yeah.
That is not something that I had heard, but, you know, Brazil actually did something like that. I think it was Brazil, where they did like this color coding system for the quality of the food, where it was, I think it was like a sort of stoplight. We maybe even talked about this in an episode where they did like green light, yellow light, red light on the labels of food that helped actually reduce overconsumption of nutritionally derelict foods, if you will. Yeah. That is kind of interesting. I think it'd be worth unpacking the data on this and see have these policies actually worked to address that concern.
Yeah.
Anyway, another interesting tidbit here is about 14% of adults experience or meet the general characteristics of food addiction. And so that's kind of a lot, actually. That's a lot more than I might have actually thought. But you know, I think given the levels of obesity that have been observed around the world, maybe that does make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
The problem with that statement that I just made is that obesity is not necessarily the result of an eating disorder or food addiction.
Right.
There are lots of things to understand and consider about that. But anyway, I was just trying to make sense of that number. Important to understand there are no data or studies on food addiction recovery. When I say no, I mean zero. There are none.
Yeah, exactly zero. Which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah. More research is needed.
More research is needed. Here's one of my favorite segments that we do, and it's all about myth busting. So we are going to myth bust a little bit because we've got to do it. Okay. All right. So there is a myth going around that you cannot measure food addiction, and that is false. The fact is that there is something called the Yale Food Addiction Scale, and it has been validated by multiple studies and can be used to help measure how serious a quote unquote food addiction might be for a person.
I am interested in learning more about that.
Yeah.
Another piece here is that food can be as addictive as heroin or cocaine. Actually, that is a myth. It cannot. Yeah. It's much closer to nicotine or caffeine, which makes sense to a point. Probably less so as nicotine, I would guess, but caffeine I could definitely see where it's like, it's not like it's that difficult to quit. It's just, you kind of don't want to a lot of the time, and stopping just means headaches.
Right. Or, you get grumpy, get irritable, all kinds of stuff happen when you don't have the foods that you like, you know?
Right.
So there's a myth going around that food addiction recovery is just weight loss, and that is false. The fact is that food addiction recovery may take on many forms, but we don't actually know since no studies have been done on this. We just don't know what food addiction recovery looks like at all.
All right, this next myth, it harkens back to a comment I made at the beginning, at the top of this discussion, which is the idea that minimally processed foods, such as fruit, quinoa, or nuts, can be addictive. And I'm sure there are people out there who love those things and eat them a lot. But the fact is, there's actually no evidence to suggest that those are, in fact, addictive. And because we're talking about, again, things that are biologically necessary, a lot of people are going to have a preference for certain foods that they eat a lot and that they really enjoy that are perfectly healthy and nutritious and good for you. And it's like, how much kale can you consume before it becomes toxic? Like way more than you're going to consume before it becomes toxic.
Yeah.
You know? So you're not eating these nutritionally sound foods to the point of excess, to the point where it's like we need to be worried about the harm.
Right.
There are plenty of foods that taste good, and you might be lumped into like the lower processed category that you probably could eat to excess. Like if you try and drink a gallon of milk in one sitting, you can die from that. That will kill you.
Yeah.
And there are other foods I think that are similar, but for the most part, we're talking about these like very unprocessed produce. You're probably very safe to eat that in whatever quantities you deem are meet your necessity to stay alive and fed.
Right. Exactly. So I think at this point in time, there's not really much more to unpack about this stuff, but we do have a couple take-home points that I think are necessary to kind of round this episode out. I think the first thing is that we are still kind of at that stage where we're asking the question of whether or not food addictions exist. And the answer is kind of, I guess. You know, there are some of the hallmarks of addiction, like excessive behavior, adverse consequences that we've kind of talked about ad nauseum across multiple episodes. But it doesn't quite meet the addiction criterion at this time, especially set forth by the DSM. What we find more so is that there are a couple symptoms, but not all of the symptoms related to that. And really what it seems like is food addiction is less an addiction and more a result or a symptom of more complex disordered eating. So it's just maybe it's like one portion or one piece of the pie compared to the larger concern of disordered eating and maybe some actual food related disorders.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, you know, food addiction is more in line with some of those behavioral addiction or disorders that we've talked about and does not necessarily fit that sort of substance abuse model that we've used to talk about excesses that are more aligned with that sort of addiction piece. And as a result, they don't exist in the same way that we know addiction to exist. That's not to say that they're not important, they're not relevant, they don't affect people. It clearly does.
Yeah.
It seems different in a fundamentally important way from some of those substance use disorders.
Right.
And it's more in line with the behavioral addictions, including complex psychological and emotional factors that lead to poor outcomes. And as I think, you know, as we mentioned earlier, oftentimes what we're looking at is some other condition that in correspondence with that condition, we see concomitant increases in other behaviors where that's not I hate saying underlying cause. I think that's a very loaded term that I think sometimes suggests something a little bit mythical, like your id or your psyche or something, or unconscious drives. Like that's not a useful way to characterize it. But oftentimes what you do have is some other set of circumstances that are important to unpacking this. And one that we didn't actually bring up in this episode is, I think a lot of times you'll get behavioral excesses that are motivated by taking a break, by an escape, right? It's like when you're stressed out, you eat.
Right.
When you're upset, you might eat these like highly comforting, sugary foods. When you want to take a break from work, like one thing that you can do is like say, I'm going to take a snack break. And well, I can't do much else while I'm like using my hands to shovel food into my face, which means I get to stop working for a little while, right? And not focus on my work. So there's a payoff for people that we've manufactured this culture of work such that motivating escape from work becomes a pretty relevant variable. And one reasonable way to escape that doesn't come with very much stigma is eating. And it doesn't have to be work either. It could be a lot of things, but like, I think it could work as an escape, and that could be very important for understanding why it happens to excess for some people.
Yeah. I have a question for you.
Shoot.
We were talking about that and kind of going over that. I think you said a lot of really great things, but you said something that I don't understand, and that is the word concomitant. So can you tell us what that word means?
Yes. Man, it's been a while since we've done a vocab, isn't it?
Yeah.
So concomitant just means essentially that it goes together. They're collaterally connected. It's accompanied by something else. When you have an increase in people golfing, you have a concomitant increase in the sale of ugly hats.
Sure. Yeah, that's good. I like that. That makes sense. That's a really great example. Yeah.
Thank you. That was off the fly. So yes, concomitant. Yeah, it's just a way of saying that there are things that go together. But good catch on the vocab.
I went, huh? And then the transcript said it, and I was like, And I looked it up to see if it was a real word or if he made it up, and then it was a real word. So I wanted you to talk about that.
See, we do live real-time fact checking here. That's how you know you're getting the good stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
I actually really appreciate that, because I definitely I have historically said things that I thought were words, and I was like, well, I mean, it sounds like a word, but I guess I made it up. Yeah. But concomitant is a word. Yes.
It's a good word. I like it.
Thank you.
So, do you have anything else you want to add to this? I don't really have much more to add. I think my biggest thing is that people are impacted greatly by food-related concerns. Like, that is certainly well within the realm of what we're talking about here. I don't know that food addiction exists the way that we think it does, though. And I think that's probably like where I end up landing more than anything else.
Well, and I think that the better way to think about it is how it relates to disordered eating.
Yeah.
I went through a period of time many years ago that I've discussed where I decided to do fasts. Like, it was a daily fast. It's a intermittent fasting is what it was called. But the way that I did it is I gave myself like a 1 hour window that I could eat, and then the rest of the day I couldn't. And I got really, really, really into cooking and baking during that time, but I wouldn't eat most of what I cooked or made. But I was just like, I spent my free time looking up recipes. I was like constantly, every day, multiple times a day at the grocery store, picking up esoteric ingredients. It was like a really weird relationship to food that wasn't addiction, but it was like
excessive.
Yeah, it was excessive. But I wasn't even eating almost any of it. I would give it all away.
Yeah.
But it was because I wasn't eating, again, unrelated, there was other things going on. My motivation for food was like through the roof high. And so that was one thing I've had. But I've actually kind of gone the opposite direction as I've gone later in life, which is I'm at the point now where I'm like, food to me feels like a waste of time.
Sure.
And I'm like, if I could never eat again, I would be pretty happy, because I would just not be spending time on this thing. With the one major caveat that, like, as I mentioned, for me, food can be like a justification for taking a break, and I desperately need more of those in my life.
Yeah.
I feel like I am just constantly busy, and any opportunity to take a break is an opportunity that I will seize. And so, that being said, like, I think it is reasonable to point out that I do very much look forward to and look for places where they have very good food, and that I do enjoy those experiences when they happen. But if I could turn off the feeling, like what I've been saying lately is, it's not so much that I like food as it is I hate feeling hungry.
Yeah.
And so, like, if I could just turn that off and have that stop controlling my time, I think I would appreciate that a lot.
Yeah.
But I haven't actually got to do that experiment yet, so maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, one day. You'll get there one day.
So that's one thing I would add. The only other thing I think that I would add is just going back to, because we didn't talk about this too much, and I just mentioned this, but thinking about the purpose this serves for people. And I think that taking a break is one of them. I think that there's a lot of culture, tradition, and comfort around food and food preparation that might start to look like addiction.
Yeah.
Because of the routine and the habit around it. I think there might be some classism, sort of elitism wrapped into this idea of, like, I get to have very fancy foods. And so people who will pay a lot of money for food, their obsession, again, could sort of look like addiction. And that what it's sort of more of a status is related to their view of themselves and their worth of themselves is like the kind of food that they could eat. I think you could see this in the space of, like, providing food for other people. And so you end up just consuming a ton of food in the meantime.
Yeah.
So I think unpacking this behaviorally, I think if we unwrap the context and the purposes that food can serve for people, it'll start to make a lot of sense how food shows up in their space in a way that might look like addiction. And maybe it's even useful to call it addiction sometimes, but ultimately I think what we call something is related to how we want to then feel about it, how we want to think about it, and what we want to do about it.
Right.
And so calling something addiction, the way that we currently understand and use the word addiction, it inherently implies it's problematic. It occurs at a level and frequency that we consider it pathological. It's bad.
Right.
And so in that space, we're essentially making a qualitative decision about whether or not something needs to be done about this. And sometimes it does. But again, sometimes treating the symptom means you're missing a part of the overall context for that person if they've got something else going on.
Right.
And so if we start to look at under what conditions do we see this type of food seeking, food engaging behavior happen, then I think we'll start to unpack to what extent is this problematic what function is this serving for this person? What else could we be doing to support them moving in a direction that's more valuable for them?
Yeah.
And so I think, as you were saying, like, it's not that even maybe it is an addiction, maybe it's not. It's like, how does that framework help us in helping to understand and support someone who maybe wants understanding and support?
Yeah.
And that's where there's utility, if any, in having this discussion. And just, again, that's why I think the behaviorist orientation is the most useful one, is because we ask the questions under what condition. We look at the context. We ask what's the purpose for the person. And that tells us so much more than speculating hypothetically about what their feelings about their dad were when they were 2,
right?
You know, like, or any other of the nonsense that's wrapped up in like how we superimpose hypothetical entities over the causes of behavior.
Right. I think you nailed it.
I scrambled in this episode to find a soapbox to climb onto and then yell for 10 minutes, but I found one and I did
There
it.
you go. Yeah, it's impressive. It's like, that's one of your superpowers. You have so many.
Apparently, I contain a multitude of these superpowers. So thank you all for bearing with me through that again. But, you know, I think part of us even wanting to do this podcast is so that we could sit here and unpack these complex psychological phenomenon using the context that's necessary to understand them.
Right.
And that's where we find ourselves. So I feel good about that.
Yeah, I feel good about it too. It feels great.
Great. See, we knew the moment I said this will be a shorter episode that it damned it. Even though we didn't have very much left to say, I found a way. So we'll still be on, I think we'll still come in at under an hour, because what we're going to do now is I am going to stop talking so that I can breathe for a moment and let advertisers come in and try and sell you food. And then we're going to come back with some recommendations. Okay, let's recommend some things. Now, I want to point out, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we are not paid by the things that we recommend. I would love it if we were. If you are out there and you're like, hey, I love that podcast just recommended our company or our brand or whatever, then we should give them money. Then I say, yes, you should. Feel free to come over and join us. But none of these, we have never recommended anything for which we have been paid. These are solely our personal experiences and recommendations that we like to throw out there for everybody. And sometimes they're not even things. They're like just a recommendation to do a thing, right? But anyway, we're recommending some things.
Recommendations.
So I am, as somebody, I will put a caveat here, as you know, I mentioned earlier that I have a sweet tooth, and I have learned over time that like what I prefer for sweets is usually chocolate, caramel, like that type of flavor palette, butterscotch, in that world, you know, savory, buttery, sweet, like stuff like that.
Love me some chocolate so much.
Yeah. Oh, well, so one thing that I always tried to avoid was jelly beans, and I don't know why. Probably because Ronald Reagan liked them, and I don't want to do anything that Ronald Reagan likes. But it was one of those things where, you know, like for some
So
reason,
good.
the other day I was like, I really wanted to try jelly beans. I really not try them, but like I really wanted to like get some. So I bought a pack of Jelly Belly jelly beans. And it's so fun because there's so many flavors in there, and they do a really good job of having like very specific flavors that like match the flavor
True.
they're trying to accomplish.
Nice.
My recommendation is just going and buying yourself a pack of Jelly Belly jelly beans.
Nice.
And just kind of seeing what's in there and discovering what you like and what you don't like. Because you're going to eat a chocolate pudding one and be like, I didn't think that I would like that one, but I do.
Yeah.
And then you're going to try a juicy pear one and be like, did not like that.
Yeah.
So it's going to be fun to kind of explore that and see what's in there.
That's great. I can totally get on board. That's really fun. And like some grocery stores will have like a section of their aisle where you can like mix and match different Jelly Belly flavors. Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah. And they're gluten-free and vegan.
Oh, wow. How about that?
Yeah.
Pretty open to the public then. All right. Jelly Belly jelly beans. Very nice. Okay. I am recommending a thing that you can do and not any particular brand or person to do it. But I'm recommending that you hire someone to do your yard work. Now, a lot of people like doing yard work, and I say more power to you. I personally, this warrants a sort of maybe a mini length discussion, so I'm not going to do the whole thing, but let's just suffice it to say, I am acutely aware of the fact that I'm going to die someday. And that Every
Sure.
second that passes in my life that I am not spending doing something valuable to me is a second I will never get back, and that is gone forever.
Yeah.
And so every second that I spend doing yard work, I feel my life draining away from me into a meaningless void where I'm sitting there pulling weeds, imagining myself laying on my deathbed going, well, that was a waste, and then just dying and my life meaning nothing.
Right.
That's how much I hate it.
Yeah.
So if you get paid to do yard work or you like doing yard work, then great. That's awesome for you. But my recommendation is that you hire someone to do your yard work and do something meaningful with your life instead. Or get paid to do yard work, and then you're at least making some money doing something that otherwise you could be doing something else. That's my recommendation. And like furthermore, like if you can afford to pay someone to go out and do your yard work for you, and many people this doesn't apply. They're like in apartments, they don't have yards. They don't have to deal with it, which then hire someone to clean your house. But furthermore, you're like, there's someone out there who wants that job, who like could really appreciate making a little cash. And, you know, they can just sort of put their time in and they get something done and you get something out of it and they make a little money and the world goes around. It's like a win-win system. So you win by not having to do yard work. They win by getting some money, and then your yard wins by not being garbage.
Yeah.
It's a great system, and that's why I'm recommending it.
I love it. Absolutely.
Okay, in the interest of getting this podcast to under an hour, I'm going to read through my credits really quick. If you'd like to join us on Patreon, you get access to behind-the-scenes content and all kinds of bonus goodies, which you definitely want. And the people who have already supported us on Patreon, who we are just indefinitely grateful to for all of their generosity, includes Mike M, Megan, Mike T, Justin, Kim, Joshua, Brad, Stephanie, Olivia, Brian, Ashley, Kiara, Christy, and Michelle. You guys, thank you so much for just thank you. Yeah.
Just the best.
Indeed. Of course, I have my team of people without whom I could not make this episode. I've got writing and fact-checking from Shane, Jess, and myself. Our social media coordinator is Emma Wilson, and our technical sound guru, maestro extraordinaire is Justin Greenhouse, who just does the best work for us. So
we love Justin.
We do. And then if you would like to reach out and tell us something about your own issues with food addiction or eating disorders, or tell us something that we got wrong in constructive criticism or something we got right in heaping praise, you can definitely do that by reaching us directly, emailing us at info@wwd.podcast.com, or on the social media platforms. We really look forward to hearing from people. As I said, we do sell merch over at our merch store, and no one looks cooler than one who has a podcast mug or shirt that they wear
very
around.
true. That is very true.
So they're like, man, that person listens to the podcast. They must be really smart.
So smart.
That's what they think. So you can go check out those things. And of course, leaving us a rating and review. Otherwise, I think that's all that I have to say. Is there anything you'd like to add or anything that I missed before we close this episode out in a timely manner, Shane?
No, I think that covers it.
Perfect. Then this is Abraham.
And this is Shane.
We're out.
See ya.
You've been listening to Why We Do What We Do. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to www.wwdpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we hope you have an awesome day.